what is illicit financial flows? What are illicit financial flows? Will my grandmother in, in Cherangani understand what illicit financial flows are? And that's a legitimate question.
I know for me, when I started doing work within this area, I was shocked by just how much money we were losing as a continent, right? Vis-a-vis the amount of money we were bringing into the continent, either through debt or through foreign direct investments or even overseas development assistance. So somebody mentioned earlier that we're losing $88.6 billion, and that's a huge amount. But when you put that into context, $86.6 billion is half the amount of money that we need as a continent to address all of these issues that have been spoken about inequality, about poverty, right, about social inadequate service provision. We already have that money within the continent, but we are losing it, and as a result find ourselves dependent on people outside of the continent to help us reach our own objectives. And for me, that's a concern. And not only that, when you think again about that figure, that $88.6 billion, the amount of money that we receive every single year as overseas development assistance, right, as support from developing countries to help this poor continent, we are losing double that. We receive $54 billion annually in overseas development assistance, but we are losing $88.6 billion. There is, to me, almost no reason why we should be finding ourselves in this position where we have a begging bowl when we have the resources to invest in our own growth and development. And this is the same as well for, when you're looking at the amount of money we're receiving as foreign direct investment, right? So many of our countries find ourselves at the whims of multinational corporations where they are, saying to us, if you don't give us incentives, we're not going to invest in your country. And we find ourselves acquiescing to these demands. Again, we are losing double the amount of money that these private sector institutions are bringing into the continent. All of this to say that if we are able to address this issue of illicit financial flows, which is what Mukasiri and what Ranga were mentioning before, this discussion about debt completely turns on its head. We are thereby able to take back this power, right, that we have given away to people that are external to this continent, and essentially bring back the sovereignty that belongs to ours. So as TJNA, what we have been doing since 2015, when this issue of illicit financial flows really came to the fore with the release of the high-level panel report, which I know you will have discussed already, we banded together with 6 other institutions, 6 other local Pan-African institutions, and said, this is an issue that we need to address. The Stop the Bleeding campaign receives, not that it doesn't receive, but was born out of Africans realizing and recognizing that this is a problem that we need to take control over and address, right? Prior to that, the discussion about illicit financial flows, and again, this may have been mentioned earlier, was a conversation that was happening outside of the continent, through institutions, very reputable institutions, such as the Global Financial Integrity. But we saw a need for us to have this conversation internally within the continent, driven by Africans, because the severity and the negative impact that these illicit financial flows are having on the continent is much worse than anywhere else. And also, when you take a look at where these illicit financial flows are going, almost 65% of our illicit financial flows is going to the OECD, right? It's going to the United Kingdom and overseas territories, right? And at present, those are the countries that are currently charting the rules for us addressing this issue of illicit financial flows. We need to take back this power that is ours. It makes no sense how we can be the richest continent on the globe, but have the poorest populations. And not only that, be completely indebted to countries that are actually benefiting from the resources that are within this continent. So I know that I don't have a lot of time, but what I really want to, sort of conclude my sentiments is by saying that we need to take control of this narrative. We need to collectively, as civil society, as media, as members of parliament, recognize that the current situation within which we find ourselves is not necessary. The current situation within which we find ourselves is one that we actually have a solution to if we are able to plug all of the holes that we currently have within our continent. And this will require a lot of things that have been discussed over the past couple of days, the necessary political will, right? And this is where our parliamentarians come into play. I loved listening to the members of parliament from Burundi talking about this. We are so dependent on you pushing forward legislation to help us address these issues. The media has a role to play because we need citizens to begin to hold our politicians and policymakers to account, because illicit financial flows completely disrupt our taxation systems. It makes no sense why you then find a situation where a woman who is potentially a single mother is contributing much more to our tax, to our treasuries than a multinational country that is exploiting our natural resources, right? So we need to ensure that our, how can I say this? We need to ensure that the citizens are well aware of the situation that is currently happening so that they recognize that change needs to happen. And the way in which they do that, the way in which they're able to ensure that change happens is by voting for people who will actually affect the change. So the power resides within the stakeholders, and the media plays a role in incentivizing and informing citizens. And then as civil society, TJNA, alongside the other Stop the Bleeding campaign partners, so this includes PALU, it includes Femnet, it includes ITUC, it includes Trust Africa, it includes Afrodad, right? Our role is to have forums such as this to build capacity, right? So that we're able to then ensure that the correct information is going out there. And the reason the Stop the Bleeding campaign, as I draw to an end with my comments, is so important is because although, for example, Afrodad's primary work area is not illicit financial flows, although, for example, Femnet's primary focus area is not illicit financial flows, although, for example, ITUC, which works on labor-related issues, their primary focus area is not illicit financial flows, every single one of us as individuals are negatively affected by insufficient resources within our countries that take away the ability for our governments to provide the services that we need for gender rights, right? For equal labor wages for those who are working in worker unions, for example, right? And so I think for me, it's just to say, I don't know if I can. I'll probably put it within this within the Zoom. We have a link where we're trying to get as many people as possible to join the Stop the Bleeding campaign, really. We want to create a movement across the continent where people are recognizing that Africa is not a poor country and we can address the situation. There's absolutely no need for us to find ourselves in situations where we have a begging bowl because we actually have the riches within our own countries.
Okay, so we're here under the auspices of Afrodad and a number of other organizations to discuss illicit financial flows, trade misinvoicing, and of course, as you heard from Chennai, what Stop the Bleeding is. So that's what, if I was to break it down into three things with regard to Stop the Bleeding. It's an African campaign to curb illicit financial flows from Africa, led and run by African organizations, right? One of the big things under illicit financial flows is trade misinvoicing. So the practice of misrepresenting the price or quantity of imports and exports in order to hide or accumulate money in other jurisdictions. And who does it affect? Honestly, I mean, it affects all of us. It affects everybody. We can go to the next slide. It affects everybody of all walks of life, whether it's your parliamentarian or the president, or it's that person that you buy groceries from at the end of the day. And there really are, 2 or 3 real tips if we could discuss this further in terms of what they are in particular, but there really are about 2 or 3 main things that need to be done. Understand and explain what IFFs are, right? And I'm sure by the end of this conference, you'll understand what IFFs are. And then explain what those things in a way that, members of the public can understand, right? So don't go to your news bulletin or to your blog, or write a headline saying illicit financial flows. That's a very difficult term for many people, even journalists, to be able to get around. So what does it really mean? Explain it within the context of a story. So some people might understand money laundering as one way of, illicit financial flows. Others might understand, the corruption that happens at the port, for instance, where there are people who are misinvoicing, over-invoicing, changing ship manifests to bring in certain things that perhaps, attract more tax than the others. Explain it in those terms so that people understand, and then tell them, you see, okay, so these are illicit financial flows. I think the second thing is to problematize the issue of IFFs consistently, right? So if you're a Kenyan, I don't know how many Kenyans are in the room, or we're all Kenyans. If you're a Kenyan, of course, today is a very, very big day to problematize the issue of illicit financial flows. It's a reading of our budget estimates. In fact, it's a big day across East Africa, right? As you've heard from the Tax Justice Network, one of the impacts of illicit financial flows is how it disrupts our taxation system, right? So if today we're going to pay 2% more on our VAT, or have another tax applied across the board that affects basic commodities, and in relation to a statement that the president of the country made about losing 2 billion shillings a day in theft and corruption, where does that money go, and how does it impact the application of taxes by the Kenya Revenue Authority, right? So this is really a big day, actually, to talk about illicit financial flows, if ever there was, one of those big days. But really, every day is a big day as long as these things are happening. And to my mind, I mean, there's different levels or layers of people who impact or affect IFFs. I think the last thing is, like, look for ways to humanize this. Why does it matter, right? Who does it matter to? Who profits? Who pays? How does it happen? And explain it in real human terms. As I was preparing for this, I was thinking, okay, so what are things that practically you can do tomorrow, right? If you wanted to go and report about IFFs and you had an assignment to go somewhere. So places where, illicit financial flows happen a lot in Africa would be ports, border points, transit points, and the institutions that manage them and apply, the various skill sets around that. So, ports, for instance, what happens at the port of Mombasa, right? Border points, transit points, because especially for the physical withdrawal of raw materials, for instance, that's where you'd be able to get a very good idea of just how much is leaving the country, right? So people within the Kenya Revenue Authority, Kenya Ports Authority, who are those sources that you have there? People who are doing clearing and forwarding at a port somewhere, right? More increasingly, though, you'll also find people who can explain IFFs to you in the capital city, right? So people such as bankers, investment bankers, people who have links to secrecy jurisdictions across the world, be it Mauritius or be it the British Virgin Isles, right? The Panama Papers, I think, taught everybody around the world that it's not just the countries in the West that use secrecy jurisdictions, or your Sani Abacha or someone else. It's business people, it's judges, it's politicians from across the world, and there's an entire infrastructure that aids the theft of capital from places like Nairobi, places like Mombasa, wherever you're from, to these jurisdictions by the way of money. But it also happens locally within our public finance management system. So if, for instance, you have leaks in the way you manage your finances publicly, that tenders are not won or awarded correctly, that money doesn't always stay here. These people are becoming smart and very adept at using new jurisdictions like Dubai to go and hide their wealth, right? So it's understanding that infrastructure. But these are the basic ones. I mean, if you're looking at some of the figures and the statistics, these are some of the areas like physically that you can go to, you know. Then another thing, search for businesses offering incredibly low prices for goods or services via importation. And just ask yourself why. Why is it so cheap? Why is it cheaper than your competitor to be able to offer these kinds of goods or services, right? You'll often find that if you pull that thread, you will often find that there's a story about illicit financial flows that is waiting to be told. Of course, unexplained or outstanding investments that don't match your sources of wealth. So if your local MCA has a palatial mansion, you know, somewhere in his, you know, in the countryside and drives a fuel guzzler, and you know what they earn, and this person has been a one-term MCA before which he or she was, you know, working some mid-tier job, right? You have to ask yourself, where is this money coming from, right? If you have a business that seems to be doing incredibly well, spending a lot of time and money on advertising, but in comparison to its sales in its balance sheet, the advertising budget is three times the amount of the sales, you start asking yourself these questions. Well, why and how is it happening, right? And sometimes it's even with those people who innocently just want to try and survive in a repressive tax environment. And I say innocently, you know, I'm using the word broadly, where you start to see, especially in very repressive tax environments where it's expensive for small and medium enterprises to be able to cope. What do? They turn to people who are adept at manipulating the system that allows for illicit financial flows to be able to then survive and build their businesses, you know, under declarations of tax, trade misinvoicing when you're exporting, those kinds of things. So finally, I just wanted to play like a short video from 2009, would you believe it? Where I had like my first or second experience with trade misinvoicing, tax evasion, illicit financial flows that had to do with the Kenya Revenue Authority, just as a simple example of how it happens, and sometimes we don't think of it that way. So I don't know whether it'll be able to play. I think it's the second last slide. Yeah, there we go. So I'll tell them to stop at some point so that you don't have to watch the entire thing.
Mombasa owes a lot of what it is today to the Mombasa port. Even at the worst of times, the presence of the port alone ensured that
without paying duty from various parts of the country, and there are cartels that are arranging this.
the information we've received so far is that an individual can import his goods and pay a quarter of the tax required by the Kenya Revenue Authority, assisted by corrupt clearing and forwarding agents. We ordered a consignment of car spare parts from Dubai and used one such company, the African Salkia Cargo Agency, to import it. They promised that we would have to pay only 51,500 shillings for the goods to be delivered to us in Nairobi approximately a quarter of the amount of money we would pay in tax alone if they were in compliance with KRA taxation requirements. But this cannot happen without the complicity of port officials as well as KRA officers in the authority's document processing center. Their duty in this department is to scrutinize all documentation for imported goods to ensure that they meet all of the KRA's stipulated taxation requirements. We wanted to establish this link.
Okay, I think we can stop there. Yeah. So this story was really about, you know, a straight case of what we had established to be tax evasion by a specific company. Now, the company is very popular with people who, especially small and medium enterprises, who don't want to pay full price to be able to import their goods because the tax regime to them is repressive. So it's actually a solution, if you think about it, to perhaps broken or oppressive tax system at that point in time. And so sometimes it's also good to understand what the drivers of people engaging in illicit financial flows are. So business people who are trying to set up sometimes use these systems and maybe unwittingly become part of that. So if you were to look at it systemically, what then would the story be to tell? Would it be about these smaller players, perhaps, which is what we did? Or is it about the tax system, right, that allows for these kinds of players to exist? Possibly, right? So you have to look at it across the board. What is systemic? What is technical? How does it affect different players in the market? And how does it, you know, impact the lives of people across your country? Of course, you know, if you're looking at the bigger fish in illicit financial flows, you'll possibly be led down to industries like mining, very big extractive commodities industries, where there's a lot of money to be gained or lost by changing the figures by maybe even 2% or 3%, right? Those are areas that you'd need to look for. Then, of course, there's, you know, the roles of multinational companies who very regularly, and I'm coming to the end with this, very regularly try and transfer, you know, engage in transfer pricing, where they underdeclare the profits or declare a loss in the country where the most economic activity is taking place, and then declare the profit somewhere else, or not respecting arm's length principles with companies that they do business with that are actually part of the same company. This happens a lot with technology companies, your Googles and what have yous. It happens a lot with shoes and apparel companies, and it happens around the world, right? So I think looking at that and trying to understand what is happening is a really important step to being able to resolve it. And then I think the final thing that I will say is to look at some of the bilateral agreements that your country gets into with other countries. So for instance, if Kenya is getting into a non-double taxation agreement with a specific country, you ask yourself why. What is the level of trade between these countries? Is that country perhaps a secrecy jurisdiction, you know, where certain people might benefit from doing so? Who are the first beneficiaries, or who are the people waiting in line to move their operations to that country because of a non-double taxation agreement, right? Those kinds of stories that you see happening that sometimes seem just like business jargon are really, I think, the sources for the beginnings of really important stories.